Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Thomas. I'm the Chief Business Correspondent at the Financial Times. I'd like to welcome you to the FT webinar today, looking at how to lead organisations in times of change. And what a lot of change we have had over a uniquely tumultuous 3 years, spanning a global pandemic, a war in a major European region, political chaos at the very top, and an economy teetering on recession in many countries. And that's not to mention supply chain upheaval, a 1970-style energy crisis, soaring inflation and labour disputes, and of course Brexit. I think we can all agree that's not been the most stable of periods. The pressures, both internal and external, on boards and leaders have never been greater. So I'm delighted to welcome two of the most respected senior business leaders to talk about what they have learned through this period and what they can draw from their many years in top management looking forward to. We are very lucky to have Anne Carnes, who concluded her executive career at the end of last year as Executive Vice Chair of MasterCard and has had roles at ABN AMRO, Citigroup, Alvarez & Marshall and Lehman's. Anne is currently the lead non-exec board member for what used to be called BAYS, now B&T, and is chair of the Financial Alliance for Women. And we also have John Allen, chair of Tesco and Barrett Developments, as well as the chair of the council at Imperial College, a senior advisor at PJT Partners, and former president of the CBI. He has held roles at WorldPay, Dixons, Deutsche Post, Royal Mail, PHS, National Grid, Wolsey, Hamley, 3i, and Connaught, but to name a few. So a wealth of experience and a lot to talk about. So I will move straight to the session. I'd like to be clear, first of all, actually, that this is an open discussion that will benefit from your involvement. So please do not hesitate to, oh God, oh my goodness. Please do not hesitate to come in and we can weave in the questions as we get them, or we can leave them to towards the end. We have a little under an hour now, so I'll try to cover as much ground as possible. And again, so much ground: economic and political challenges, rising energy prices, Russia cutting off gas supplies to Europe, the continued drive to net zero, cyber risk, ESG, stagflation, interest rates, recession. It sounds like an REM song. So I thought to begin with, I'd like to go with something a bit more personal. And Anne, could I ask you, first of all, to begin with some thoughts about what has been the biggest challenge for you personally over the past couple of years, and what 2 years we've had, and what sort of management lessons did you learn? And I realize you've had so many years and so many different roles, but what management lessons did you learn from this period?
Well, thanks, Dan. It's a great question, and I've got to reflect that it's only in the last 2 years that I actually did a government job in Britain, where I joined the government as an advisor. In fact, I was the lead non-executive for business, energy and industrial strategy. And I'd never done that kind of role with our government before. And as you pointed out, there have been tumultuous things happening during that time, such as, the outbreak of war in the Ukraine and a lot of focus on energy strategy and security. There's the aftermath of Brexit, how to execute it, and that's still going on today. And then, of course, all the implications that we've seen of, the rise in inflation and so on. And I think that being in a government role was so different from the corporate world. In some ways, it was quite surprising to me. I found I thought I was used to constant change in the corporate world. But working with the British government over the last 2 years, I realized that change was just at a completely different level from what I'd experienced. And I think that basically you have to change the pace that you work at, but also you have to change your expectations of work. And that's what's probably been happening to everyone, quite honestly, during COVID. But when I say this, what I mean is, if you're in the corporate world and you have a board meeting, then that's kind of, it's scheduled a year, sometimes 2 years in advance. Everyone knows what's happening in their diary and you're all working towards that date, and you do things like cancel flights if you need to make sure that you can be there at that point in time. You don't take that same approach when you're working with the government, because suddenly things could be cancelled at very short notice. You might suddenly find that, you have 2 different ministers from the time the board meeting was set, and nothing is particularly set in stone. So it's a much more sort of fire drill environment, much more difficult actually than working in the corporate world.
That's interesting. Yeah, I always assume that the public sector would be relatively quite well slow to move actually. And from what you're saying here is actually you were trying to bring some private sector structures around what was going on, because that is the role of the non-executive, isn't it, to bring in that private sector experience.
Completely. And, I would say, this thing about slowness and fastness, of course. I mean, if you're constantly chopping and changing and so on, then it can make you slower to deliver something. Um, and so, I'm talking about the way of working rather than the output.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And I'd like to come back to the studying the politics of what you guys have seen in the past 18 months. I mean, three prime ministers, as many chancellors, obviously. So, to name but one of the obvious areas of change. But before we get there, John, just take us through, about one of the key things from the past 2 years for you, and again, like what has been new to you that you've taken away that you haven't encountered in your career so far?
Well, I think the lesson I relearned, Dan, because I think I knew this earlier, I should have known it earlier, was managing through COVID in three different organizations, Tesco, Barrett's, and Imperial College. In every case, the response was different. In Tesco, we were feeding the country, we were essential workers. Everyone pretty much had to come to work. Out of our 330,000 employees, over 300,000 work in stores or distribution centres. They weren't able to stay at home. So we had to find ways of enabling them to operate safely, our customers to operate safely, and that's why you saw the invention very rapidly of things like traffic lights to control the number of people in stores, partitions between separating checkout operators off from customers, etc. In addition, we had 25,000 employees who had to be sent home because they had medical vulnerabilities and they couldn't stay in the workplace. And to balance that, we had to recruit about 30,000 temporary staff, all in the course of just a few weeks. And that was a sort of massive exercise. But I guess the lesson I learned from that, and it was reinforced by the other experiences, was that you need to have certain key things in place if you're going to do this well. You've got to have an absolutely crystal clear, purpose and set of values, so that there is a yardstick against which management can make decisions, the board can judge their actions. You need to have a great management team, because there's no way the degree of complexity, the number of decisions that needed to be made on an hour by hour basis through COVID could have been made by a board. Even if the board had wanted to, it wouldn't have been capable of doing it. So you have to have, I think, a great management team, trust between management and the board, and then a good reporting system so that you learn after the event what has actually happened, and you have a chance to kind of interrogate people and see what's worked and what hasn't worked. And inevitably, when you make a large number of decisions on the run, not all of them are actually going to be important. But what that brings home, I think, is the importance of trust between the management team and the board. You can't second guess them. You can't look over their shoulders the whole time. You've got to trust them to actually get on with it. And we were still in the throes 2 years ago. We were still in the throes of COVID. We'd learned how to operate it, but we were still working out how to come out of it. And so, I think that was a very, very clear lesson. And the same was true in the other two organisations I chair. Barrett's, we had to stop work because, send people home, work out a new way of building houses, which was safe for our colleagues. If you think about it, building houses out in the open air should be a relatively safe occupation from a COVID perspective, sometimes hazardous for other reasons. But we had to sit down, talk with our peers in the industry about devising a new way of working that would enable us to resume work safely and take all the decisions related to that. And finally, in case of Imperial, of course, COVID brought everything to a halt. Students had to go home if they could. We had to move towards using audiovisual media to hold lectures and seminars and so on. Some bright spark at Imperial invented the experiment in a box. Many of our students are doing science and technology, and time spent in the laboratory is very important. So these boxes were invented, which could be parceled off, sent around the world to wherever our students were, so they could actually get some lab experience at home. Again, I think the institution adapted incredibly rapidly to that the need for change. Things that they had thought would take years to take place took place in about 4 weeks, and they were energized and made themselves achieve the impossible at that time. So the consistent thread, I think, is really that people had to take decisions very rapidly. Boards had to trust management to get on with it, and to accept the fact that along the way, if you're making 100 decisions, if 95 of them were right and only 5 were wrong, frankly, you were doing exceptionally well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but no, in those first few days of the pandemic, and it's almost difficult to think back now because it just seems mad, doesn't it? But I mean, how do you as a leader pick the management up or just get them directed? Because that, I remember like picking out my bags and my laptop, being told to go home, and there was just the feeling of what next, and I think that's the part of the leadership thing, isn't it? Of being able to say, look, this is what we're going to do. We need to do this. So John, I mean, what did you learn those first few days as someone who had to sort of pick up the boards of these different
Well,
respective places?
I think I had very early discussions with the management in each of these cases about who was going to do what, and I think fortunately they were convinced that they needed to do the micromanagement that was needed. And the role of the board, or whatever it's called, the council in the case of Imperial, was essentially to look over their shoulders after the event, not to try to second guess them. And then, my job was to encourage management to get on with it, to make the decisions they needed to make as rapidly as ever they could, and to convey a sense of confidence that management were doing what they were doing, they knew what they were doing, to the rest of the board in each case. So I suppose I was a sort of intermediary between management and the board. But I think one of the things you learn when you become a chair is that you've got to clear your mind of any sense that you're actually managing the organisation. It's the management team and the CEO in particular who manage. Your job is to support, challenge, perhaps give them new ideas, hold them in a bit occasionally, but essentially the vast majority of getting on with running the organisation has to lie with management. And I think COVID was a marvellous example of that. Boards could not, I know 1 or 2 boards that tried to manage it, and they discovered that the notion of having a board meeting every day got a bit too much for them, whereas management teams were meeting every single day to take decisions as they went. And, that was their job, and many of them, I think, did it magnificently, not just in the organisations I'm involved with, but in others. People did an amazing job, I think, of responding to extremely difficult situations.
Yeah, no, I agree. Corporate Britain did come through in good nick, it would say. But Anne, coming to you on those points, I mean, during those 2 years of the pandemic, I mean, you must have been really just hard. I mean, absolutely hard at it, just trying to work out with the management, with your teams about what every day would hold for you.
Well, it's interesting because, I was a working executive, unlike John's position. And so part of the management team of MasterCard, which of course mobilized very fast. And we were really lucky because being a tech company, we could immediately take everyone, into the virtual world and continue our business as is. Of course, we were seeing other things happening. We saw dramatic increases in the amount of digital payments. I mean, they were just, 10 times higher than we'd seen in previous years, and, massive peaks coming through as we went into COVID. But also one of the things that our CEO did, which I thought was really good, was that he went out and he said to everyone in the world, don't worry, nobody's going to lose their job this year because of COVID, right? Your jobs are safe inside MasterCard. Now, MasterCard's not a huge employer. I mean, yes, it's a 360 or 70 billion cap market company, but it only has about 25,000 people around the world because it's so technologically advanced. It's moving billions of transactions in real time. But nevertheless, it's fantastic for a CEO to go and do that and be so clear about it so early in the game. And that was a benefit of actually being in our business. And I think this sort of sense of, John's right, you know, management teams are meeting every day and you're monitoring things such as, you know, what's happening on the ground with all of our customers and consumers and so on, but also what's happening with our employees. You know, we were tracking what the different conditions were in each country and what the advice was that was being given. We were lucky because we were a global company, and as we know, it started in China. So we had early warning from our Chinese, actually, about lockdown and how this was going to look. And it just went back from Asia across Europe into America quite quickly. But that early warning was also a very good planning period.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a extreme period of uncertainty, and the interesting thing when the pandemic ended, you know, there was this sort of well, I say pandemic, the lockdowns ended. Obviously, to some degree, were always going to be present, but when the lockdowns ended and the world got back to normal, there's a sense of great relief, and then the sense of great uncertainty was returned in the sense of what's going to happen now with the economy and then the political situation, to your point earlier, Anne, as well. I mean, what from back to you, John, just quickly. I mean, from where you're sitting and you've got, you know, in the portfolio Barratt and Tesco's, who are really exposed to the consumer economy, particularly. I mean, how do you manage through a period where you don't know if at the end of the year we're in recession. You don't know if we're going to be booming again because, you know, things have dramatically reversed and we're coming out great guns one more time. I mean, how as a company do you prepare for that sort of level of financial uncertainty?
Well, I'm not sure you can prepare for it. I think you have to respond to it. If you take, you know, the supermarket industry, clearly our customers, many of our customers and our competitors' customers, are suffering very badly from the cost of living crisis at the moment. People look at high levels of inflation on food and energy and so on, and they don't always recognize that those things bear more heavily on people with the lower incomes. That, you know, if you're spending, the average UK consumer spends about 9%, I think, of their budget on food. But if you're in the bottom quartile or decile of the income distribution, it's probably closer to 15 to 20%, and therefore a 10 or 15% hike in prices means much more than if you were in the top quartile. So we're very conscious of that, and what we and our competitors, and I wouldn't claim any great sort of virtue on the part of Tesco in this, well, a bit, has been to try and ensure we hold prices down as much as we can. We challenge people who are putting prices up to justify why they're putting those prices up. We offer lower price alternatives, own label, in our entry layer, exclusive to Tesco. And what we're seeing from customers is very significant trading down as they try to make their money go further by, instead of buying branded baked bean, which will remain nameless, buying, you know, Tesco baked beans or our entry tier, which are considerably cheaper. So customers, I think, giving people the opportunity to make choices to enable them to help their budgets go further. You'll have seen Tesco running ads challenging people to look in their fridges and see what they've got before they go out and shop, because a lot of food is wasted in the home. And I think if we can help people to learn to waste less food, that helps as well. I mean, mind you, if you're in the poorest section of society, you probably haven't got anything in your fridge, you know, so that's a message that's more relevant to at least people on middle incomes and above. So I think we've been running ads with meals that you can make for a family of four for £2.50 with all the ingredients and the recipe there and all the rest of it. And our competitors have been doing similar things. So I think it's a very determined effort to try to help people whose income is not keeping up with inflation, to be able to live more economically and make their money go further. In the house building industry, where, you know, demand is down at the moment a bit, not catastrophically down, but somewhat down, all the house builders have learned that the market goes through these periods of difficulty and the importance of keeping a very strong balance sheet, so that if there is a slump in demand, you've actually got the kind of financial firepower to see your way through it. And so I think different sectors, different industries, different companies have different remedies. But what we're all trying to do, I think, is to find a way of making life tolerable for those who are hardest hit. And if I can give you a final example, last week was half term in much of the country. Tesco was running its Kids Eat Free in our cafes because we are conscious that people who perhaps benefit during term time from free school meals suddenly have to find the cost of feeding their kids during the holidays, and us being able to do a little bit to make that easier for them is something that kind of helps.
Yeah,
a very, very stressed section of the population. And all of that, I think, is consistent with, and I come back to purpose. I know there is a certain unfashionability now about purpose, but having a very clear purpose of what you are trying to do as a company, it becomes very easy to see what are the actions that are reinforcing living up to that purpose, and which are the actions which, if you were to take them, would actually undercut that purpose. And that's a marvelous yardstick, I think, for management to make decisions against.
Yeah, particularly in a period where you don't really know what's around the corner. Would you agree with that, Anne? Is that sense of purpose the key thing to almost underline a flexibility that John talks about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion right now that nobody wants to join a company that doesn't have a sense of purpose. And if you go right into the whole ESG discussion and debate, it's not just about purpose, but it's about having a strategy that thinks about what are you doing in the wider sense for the planet and the people on the planet. And your investors are very interested and active in this story as well, perhaps because capital markets bring forward the risk of things like climate change. And if you're not doing enough about it and thinking enough about it. Now, I'm not suggesting that every company needs to be thinking about every area of ESG, by the way, because if you take a company like MasterCard, they were very much in the financial inclusion space, and the social aspects of things, and they had net zero goals to reach by 2040. But other companies that are in green energy and traditional energy, like the oil companies and so on, they're going to be much more focused on that side of the spectrum. Everybody should, in my view, develop a set of goals and strategy and develop their purpose around the things that they are good at and care about and are at the heart of their business. All the things that John talked about for Tesco, actually, thinking about how people can create inexpensive meals for themselves, thinking about food and avoiding food waste. And so that makes absolutely clear sense in that industry. As soon as you see industries going outside their core strengths, then you become a bit skeptical about what they're really trying to do and what message they're giving to the world and to the markets.
How would you communicate in a period as we do at the moment with high inflation? And to both of you, really, it's it's a period where lots of people are seeing below inflation pay rises within their companies, potentially at least, and needing some help with the cost of living crisis. But at the same time, you're running companies, you're running a P&L, you need to make money as well. How do you sort of navigate that as a concept? I'd be really interested to know.
I don't know if Anne would like to go first on that. I've got a few thoughts.
No, I mean, things that I've seen are that companies are doing adjustments, sort of one-off adjustments, rather than building in year after year inflationary pay rises, because there's a lot of discussion, isn't there, that inflation is going to drop significantly, we hope, by the end of this year. So they're trying not to build in systemic long-term solutions that will hurt their profitability long-term. It's really interesting because, demographically, I think John and I are at that part of the population where perhaps, we've earned and saved for years and earned nothing on our savings and, and so on for a long time. And so, perhaps a little bit of rise in interest rates in response to inflation isn't necessarily a bad thing. Perhaps they've been held artificially low for too long, and there needs to be some kind of balance around here. I I was listening to the head of one of the big investment banks talking the other day, and he was saying if we could reach 4% inflation, 4% interest rate rise, and 4% kind of unemployment level, things would be great. Well, I think they would be great. I mean, that's sort of a bit of a nirvana, but I mean, I think the point he was trying to really make is these things are all linked and it's a balance. And, you know, what we really want to do is get to something which is manageable and we don't feel that any area is getting specifically out of control, which is, I think, how we felt a little bit in the last 18 months.
Yeah.
I think I'd just add to that, Dan, that, you know, I think you've got to look at your various stakeholders and decide what to do. And sometimes these are, you know, there are trade-offs to be made. I think Tesco through the pandemic and right up to now and into this era of high inflation, we've said really, you know, looking after those of our workforce who are actually in the front line in our stores and our distribution centres is absolutely vital. We announced yesterday our third pay increase in 10 months because we recognise that, you know, many of those people are struggling, many of those colleagues. So, you know, we've put a lot of investment into our wage bill. We have some productivity programs which are partially offsetting that, but they won't completely offset it. We've tried to look after our customers by keeping prices down as much as we could, inflating a little less quickly than the competitors. But, you know, then you say, well, look, but hang on, who picks up the bill? Well, the answer is we are going to end up, you know, we're close to the end of our financial year. The expectation of the market is that our profits will be roughly speaking flat compared with last year. Now, if we hadn't done some of the stuff we have done to look after our customers and our colleagues, we could have made more money this year. Our view was that was, you know, that would have been a kind of temporary gain at the expense of not keeping faith with two vital stakeholder groups, our people who work for us and our customers. So I think you have to recognize you can't actually satisfy everybody equally all of the time. But what we've done is to be very upfront with our shareholders, tell them what we were doing, tell them what the implications of that would be with them. And most of them, I think, have agreed with us that that was the right way to proceed. So I think communication is absolutely vital, being upfront and not surprising markets. I think one of the things I've learned over an lengthy career is, you know, if you can see a problem coming, you're better to share it early so that people are ready for it, as opposed to you know, disclosing it at the very last moment when it's unavoidable.
Yeah, the market hate being spooked. Just a reminder that we are taking questions from the audience, and there's one here which I think kind of relates to what we're talking about here, and it's the question, and it's a slightly different take on the need to think about the workforce, but the question is, how does the board keep up with the changing worker? And I think you almost could put that in inverted commas, can't you? The idea that there's been a lot more emphasis on employee flexibility since the pandemic, and how do you keep a staff which is increasingly demanding flexible working, wanting flexible working? How do you keep them happy at the same time as making sure the business is being well looked after? And what do you think? I mean, MasterCard must have had a great deal of flexibility, I'd have thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a very different situation to John. John was very clear at the very beginning that, you know, he had to have Tesco had to have a significant amount of their workforce during COVID in a physical environment. Because we're a technology company, I mean, things could be ultimately flexible for us. Now, I mean, people have to man data centers and things like that, but it's few and far between. Having said that, though, when you look at your employees and, you know, look at the new people who join your company during that time. I mean, it might be 5,000 or 10,000 people, and they've never met their co-workers. Many of them very young. They're millennials in general, or younger actually now, and perhaps they've even gone through university and had that university experience of being isolated as well, which I've heard has actually been very difficult for some students. I'm sure John knows from his Imperial College experience. So certainly the young people want to connect, and they want to be in an environment where they make friends. That's actually how we all ended up doing business to a certain extent. Linda Grattan, who's a friend of mine and a professor at London Business School, has written a wonderful book about the future of work. And in that she says, in essence, many people go to work because they build friendships there. And you can't replace that with technology. So I think there are many social aspects as well as business aspects why you have to think that hybrid is really the future. And then it's a question of what kind of hybrid do you design? And in a technology industry, you have a lot of flexibility. In other industries, you don't. But, in other industries, you can create things like 4-day working weeks. Depending on the hours and the structure and so on. And flexibility is not just about location, it's about time. So you need to be thinking of all of these angles.
Yeah, and perhaps, John, about the communication element as well on this one. But do you think, John, that this is a permanent shift now in how the workforce is shaped, how it's designed?
I think, when people have been through a very profound experience, pretty traumatic experience, in many cases, it would be kind of naive to assume that you can just sort of wave a magic wand and go back to the sort of status quo ante. On the other hand, I think Anne was absolutely right. I think there's a price to be paid, particularly for young workers, one of the ways in which young workers, and I was one once, I think, get up the learning curve was by sitting next to and learning from more experienced people. If they're denied that opportunity because everybody is out the whole time, then I think it definitely has, some negative impact. I think the work has got a social purpose. If you haven't got that, you lose something as well. But I don't think we're going to go back to kind of everyone being in the office from, 9 a.m. until on Monday to 5:30 p.m. on Friday. In stores, we've tried to respond to it by giving people the opportunity to work more or fewer hours if it suits their needs. And we're introducing systems that mean that if you want to work, you're a person working with Tesco, you want to work more hours and they're not available in your local store, you can look at other stores in the vicinity, and we're pretty thick on the ground everywhere, and actually work a shift in another store to give you the additional hours and perhaps the additional income that you need. So, but I don't think we're not going to go back to where we were. And I think we've got to be realistic about that.
Yeah. How do you manage through that though? I mean, is it how do you sort of instill that sort of corporate sense of identity, which I think sometimes gets lost if people spend more than perhaps a couple of days away from their workplace?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a single point answer for everyone, but what I think people are doing is some people are trying to make it attractive to come in. You come in to work and you get a free lunch or something, and there are social activities around for people to come into. Some have tried to be a bit more directive and have said, look, we would expect you in the office 3 days a week. What that tends to lead to is people working in the office Tuesday to Thursday, which is one of the reasons why the rail companies are now looking at offering half-price tickets on Monday because the trains are relatively empty. So I think we're still in a sort of settling down period, and it's way too early, I think, to be 100% confident about what the ultimate answer will be.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's even firm-wide, Dan, because you could have somebody who is a CFO and they might want their department in more because they're in a control function and they've got, all sorts of activities that have got to be checked and rechecked and so on. And then other people are running a sales team and they actually don't want to see their sales team in the office because they would rather they'd be out in the customer's office or with the customer on the telephone or screen selling the product. So it's very dependent on job function within companies as well.
Yeah, I think so. I've just written about the 4-day working week, and it's it's fascinating to see how companies are adapting to this different way of working. We've got some really interesting management questions coming in. I will come to them in a bit, but just to conclude on some of the more kind of interesting challenges facing companies at the moment, and that there are two specific areas I want to talk about. And John, Stan's already mentioned this. I'm going to come to you next, but this idea of net zero and the move to a carbon neutral position. I mean, how do you as a company, as a leader, position your teams, position your structures to that end? And is that one of the biggest challenges do you think at the moment for many companies?
I think it is. Well, and it's not only a challenge, I think it's a necessity. And certainly the companies that I'm involved with take it very, very seriously indeed. We have plans to deal with all the potential emissions we're responsible for. For many companies, I think dealing with sort of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions is relatively straightforward. But there are industries, and it's true of both house building and the food, agriculture, food manufacturing, and so on, where the upstream and downstream emissions massively outweigh the things that are directly within your control within the business. So I think what many of us are wrestling with at the moment is, how do you define scope 3 emissions, the things that you are not directly responsible for, but which you're going to make yourself accountable for? Do you go back to the southern Amazon and sort of say all those cattle that are being reared that are emitting large quantities of methane, which is one of the most dangerous gases in terms of impact on the atmosphere, that we're going to take responsibility for that? Or do you start when food starts to be manufactured, or what? But I'd say that if you leave aside our parochial interests in this, I think food production, agriculture and food production, is the biggest challenge for the globe achieving net zero. I think we'll find alternative power things. We'll end up with electrically powered or hydrogen powered vehicles or whatever. We will eventually try to, as far as we can, neutralize the carbon emissions from buildings. We can build new builds already are very, very good, but we've got a legacy of 25 million homes in the UK which have been built from any time in the last 200 years, which are much less efficient. But the biggest challenge, I think, is food, because world population is still growing in the southern hemisphere. Those people have aspirations, legitimate aspirations, to want to eat better. Often that is about eating meat, which, and for us in the prosperous north to turn around and say, well, we've had access to meat for 200 years, but you can't have it because it's bad for the environment, is an impossible position to take up. So I think the biggest challenge of net zero is going to be agriculture and food manufacturing and food distribution, and that the UK is a pimple in that particular issue. But I do think we have an opportunity in this country, and if we start to think about the future, I can get very depressed about the short term, where we are at the moment. Perpetual crisis, stagnation, going nowhere. But I'm a long-term optimist that actually this country can prosper again and can grow again. And it's only if we grow again that we're actually going to be able to improve the living standards of our population, which have been sort of static for the last decade. And I think, showing the way in terms of green technology and all the rest of it is an area where the UK can make its mark and not only do the right thing, but use that to stimulate economic growth as well. So I'm sort of short-term pessimist, long-term optimist.
Yeah, indeed. And I'll be slightly cheeky and ask you for a view of whether or not you think, and you can absolutely duck this question, but whether or not I think the government's still focused on this as an area, having sat within the bays which had certainly had a part of this as their purview, business interests in green and green technology, and they had various strategies going on. Is the government still focused as much as it should do on this area, do you think, on the environment and on pushing companies? And because we all know that there are good companies and there are bad companies, and I wouldn't expect anyone to be on a FT conference, I'll be honest, which isn't one of the good companies, one of the good guys, but it's so there has to be a role for government, doesn't there?
Listen, I do think the government are pretty focused on it. Before BEIS was split up the other week, energy was a huge portion of the work in the department, and the fact that they've created a department just completely focused against energy is a good thing. I mean, I don't think that the split is a bad thing, because now they're split into energy, science, and they've merged the business part with the trade department. And you could actually say, well, that makes much more sense than having this great big conglomerate where you didn't have focus. And I believe that. It's just that, it is quite a big piece of government reorganization. It's not a bad thing. It's probably a good thing longer term. And I'm with John actually on the short-term pessimism, long-term optimism. I think we do have to be optimistic long-term to be business leaders in the first place, or you would never get out of bed in the morning. But I think that we are already a leader in offshore power generation. I mean, 47% of the national grid can be provided by offshore wind power. It's absolutely phenomenal. Now, we don't actually design and build our own turbines. We import them from Germany and Sweden, but we don't have to, because, we have the knowledge about how to harness this, distribute it, and we're using it for the benefit of the population here as well. So I think things that we excel at, such as that kind of scientific design, that knowledge about how to run these networks, these are things that we can export around the world. We're still super good in the financial industry. I think it's 27% of our GDP comes from, basically the financial sector. Is it about that? And it's not something you hear discussed very much. There was a big worry during Brexit that, all sorts of bad things were going to happen in the city. Some bad things have happened. Oil contracts have moved to America. We haven't done as many listings on the stock exchange as we would like to do, etc. But we're still a financial powerhouse, and we could, increase that in the future. We have the capability to do that. So I think we know what we're good at, and we should actually focus on that, and then eliminating these things that are actually stopping us progressing. I know that there's a lot of discussion about the Irish Protocol at the moment and reaching some sort of practical solution, and I think any British government should be doing that. So because we want our businesses to thrive and prosper, we want our population to basically benefit from this, as John says.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating time, undoubtedly. And I mean, as someone who's come from a technology company, financial services technology company, I'm going to start taking some more questions from the audience. And the question is specifically, how often does the board assess its cybersecurity risk, and is that the main threat to today's businesses? And I'm going to slightly broaden out as a question to both of you, really, and to say, how often do the boards assess technology in the round as both a risk and a path for growth and opportunity? How close do you have to be to those technological changes as a board, as a leader, as a manager? And how do you take those things which are threats and potentially move them into more of a positive sort of space? And if you don't mind, I'm going to stay with you and ask you, because we were talking about technology.
So, I mean, look, every board that I know, every board has a risk committee, and the risk committee look at all of the risks facing the business, and cyber risk is for sure one of the highest risks that would be on any risk committee's radar system, and it would probably be very high, almost the top probably, if you were in an industry that's technological, moving money around. Not all industries are like that, but it is a big risk, and it's a risk that includes things like state actors, not just people who are out there committing fraud and so on, acting in the general public, if you see what I mean. So So the risk committees would meet as frequently as the boards, and I think in Britain, say, bank boards are meeting every month anyway, and this would certainly be on the table, what's been happening, and then if any big event had occurred, and I think we all know what the big events are because we read about them in the papers as well, then these get deep dive reviews by the risk committees, and the risk committees come in and report to the board, which is the right way to do it, because at the board level, you know, you've got a lot of people around the table that don't need to be at a very deep level, but at the risk committee level, you certainly are. You certainly have those people that deep dive and kick the tires on cybersecurity.
And how do you sort of take how close do you get to the sort of technology changes that are happening within an organization? Because there, I don't think about the FT. There's so many different things going on at any given time. There's people squirreled away in rooms, developing apps and all sorts of things. And how close do you have to be to all those changes, which could be fundamental, could change your industry, couldn't they?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said fundamental, Dan, because I mean, if you're sitting in a technology industry, yes, there's millions of things happening every day in every room that one hopes. Labs in a box, basically, as John described earlier, though I think he might have been talking about chemistry. But the thing is that what the board would do is look at things which could fundamentally change your industry. So, it could be like, how quickly is cryptocurrency going to be adopted around the world? Will it be, what will happen with central bank currencies versus, the something like blockchain? How quickly would people adopt that? And also things like, how quickly are people just adopting electronic payments? Because for years we were seeing big white space out there with, many cash transactions happening. That changed dramatically in the developed worlds during COVID, and it hasn't bounced back. I mean, I'm sure you are getting on the tube, buying a cup of coffee and so on, and you're just tapping your card or you're using Apple Pay or whatever you do. Whereas in the past, you might have just put your hand in your pocket and got out, a couple of pounds and paid for your coffee, right? Nobody is now. So that has changed, and it's sticky. The change is sticky, and it can happen really quickly. So those are the kinds of technological changes that I think are important at the board level.
Yeah. How do you navigate that, John?
Yeah, I think the same issues are true for many companies. Tesco with thousands of stores, millions of customers, 20 million club card holders. The whole thing is held together by technology. We've got a very, very large investment in trying to get more out of it. And we try to bring the board into that at least twice a year. We also talk separately at the board level about cybersecurity, because one of my ambitions on the board is to get people constantly worried about cybersecurity and not feel complacent, because I think we are all vulnerable in one way or another, and all you can do is try and build your defenses faster than the bad guys out there are building their means of attack. So we do all the things that I'm sure Anne and others do in spades. We have regular penetration tests by third parties to see whether they can break into our systems. We change the people who do that regularly so they don't get complacent. And every now and then they find, a vulnerability, which we then attempt to sort of seal off as rapidly as we can. And we do have some attacks as well. We had something in Hungary about 18 months ago. Somebody broke into our systems through one of our distribution centers and caused some damage. And we responded very quickly and put it right, which was good, but it taught us that there was a vulnerability there that we hadn't really properly blocked off in the past. So I think, I think boards should be anxious and concerned and a bit worried about cybersecurity, because the nature of future threats is not crystal clear. There are some very, very nasty people, both individuals and states out there, dreaming up new ways of penetrating or, basically shutting down people's systems. And the amount of damage they can cause is very, very considerable. Financial damage, but also if companies don't handle it well. We've seen some good examples in the UK of, reputational damage when companies have not been well set up to communicate about what's actually happened to their systems.
Yeah, and on the technology, yeah, but the technology thing is, I think, I'll come back to you. But there's a question which I think relates to what you're talking about, really. Well, but to both of you, really. So, when the question is from the audience is how do you challenge your business to test resilience? What's your approach to ensuring your business has really thought about potential downside scenarios sufficiently?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess comes to your point about sort of almost an integral paranoia to some degree.
Yeah, I think a bit of paranoia isn't a bad thing within a company. But I'm not sure the companies I'm involved with do anything that's particularly unusual or noteworthy. But we do look at exercises to test our contingency plans and actually doing it. So having a written down kind of business continuity plan is one thing, but does it actually work in practice? And when it's a bit like a lifeboat drill. When everybody has to get into the lifeboats, does it actually work? And I think that's something that many businesses are guilty of thinking, because there is some beautifully written plan on the shelf, that means that they can take it down and use it when they need it. And that's when they may discover at the absolutely wrong time that it doesn't work.
Well, it's interesting that actually, John, because I was working with an organisation, chairing an organisation, that one of the contingency plans was if there was, say, a bomb threat in the centre of London, this is a financial group, that it would move out into Essex somewhere where the data centres were and would continue the business. Right. Then, of course, COVID hit. And there's no way that contingency plan would have worked, because you don't want a whole group of people piling into a data center and infecting the data center people who are running the core computer systems with COVID. So actually, the virus would change your contingency plans. And the virus might have taken you out of central London, but it turned out that, you didn't need to go anywhere. You just actually went virtual. So there was a much easier way to solve what you were trying to do. You were physically relocating people, whereas if your contingency plans had just said, send everybody home and put them on the computer, would have been a simpler plan. So it's quite interesting about the external threats that you're trying to mitigate and the solutions you come up with, because you're, what was it? It's like Einstein, you're creating the solution in the framework that you first framed it. You haven't come up with the best one.
How do you make sure you're listening to the right people from a board level? I mean, again, the person who has the solution, who has the next bit of technology, which is going to fundamentally change how someone shops or spends money, that they're probably not sitting on the board right now. I mean, how do you make sure that those people are sort of getting to where you can see them and hear them?
Do you mean this, Dan, specifically in relation to risk or more generally?
I'm thinking more in terms of technology and technological change, John.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you need to have some people within your organization whose job is to look outside and see what's happening and what is possible. A kind of innovation group who are not there, just simply upgrading, maintaining or upgrading, testing the current systems, but are looking for, the next mousetrap. And I think that's affordable in a relatively large company, much more affordable than a very small company. And it's a necessary investment, I think, to look outside and not spend all of your time looking inside.
Yeah.
I think also that you can invite people to your board meetings, who are good in their fields and in an adjacent field to you, or CEOs from different companies. In fact, that should be encouraged, to hear what they're saying is happening in the market.
Yeah. I think it seems now that that's perhaps the pandemic's almost helped that. I got the sense from certainly directly after the pandemic, a lot of CEOs were almost more visible than they had been before, and perhaps that's an advantage there. We've got a couple of questions which are specifically around management skills and where priorities should lie. So there are two questions. I'll ask them both so you can sort of start thinking about them. So the first one is what skills do you think are required of today's business leader, which I suppose suggests that what's different from what they were perhaps in the past. And the second question is, how do successful business leaders prioritize their time? And can you share any advice about prioritizing time as a business leader, as to individuals who have clearly got a lot on your plates? So John, to kick off, and what skills do you think are required of today's business leaders?
I think some of them are hardy perennials. I think if you're going to be a successful leader, somebody once said, you can't be a leader if you haven't got followers. I think you've got to have the ability to work with people to create solutions and then communicate those solutions and motivate people to get out and implement those solutions. So an awful lot of it is about interpersonal skills and your ability to motivate people to get on and do the right things. And to a large extent, the old sort of hierarchical kind of structures where somebody at the top came down from the mountain with 2 tablets of stone and handed them to his 2 assistants, and they then sort of transcribed them and sent them down, and it was a cascading process. With modern technology, you can communicate very, very broadly across the organization very quickly. You can and should, and that actually can make the role of middle management more difficult, because if the CEO or the divisional CEO or whatever is communicating very directly to people what is expected of them, you've got to be very careful you don't actually just cut out middle management and leave them feeling disenfranchised and they haven't got a role to play. So I think you still need management to make things happen, but it's got to be treated in a different way. So I think the hardy perennials, I think, are this ability to define what needs to be done, motivate people to do it, communicate. I think you can't communicate too often and too much. That's, it sounds terribly straightforward, but it's actually quite difficult to do in practice.
Yeah, I'm sure you agree with much of that, Anne.
I do.
Just to add a little bit, because I'm no longer really a day-to-day manager of things. When you move into the sort of role that I'm in, chairing companies, you need a very different set of skills. I mean, you need to be able to listen. You can no longer issue orders, so you have to be able to influence people to do the right things, persuade them to do the right things, because you can't just, issue. CEO can issue orders of the day, and by and large, people will do what they're told. The chair of a company, I think, has to work through people, has to persuade them, has to influence them, and that's a very different sort of skill set, and one which some CEOs transition into magnificently well, and some actually find very difficult.
Yeah. But there you go. But yeah, interpersonal skills. Is that the key to this? Is that the key to a good manager?
I actually think it's communication skills, and I laugh about the interpersonal piece because John said you can't be a leader without followers, and of course today many of us have followers on social media. And whether you consider that interpersonal or not is a very interesting question, isn't it? We're moving into the metaverse. And I think this will continue. So I think it's being an effective communicator across all channels that's important. And the other thing is knowing what to say. I can tell you that as chair of the 30% Club, I had a group of CEOs that when the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and the Floyd killing in New York happened, they were talking to each other saying, how do we actually talk to the workforce about this? Because we want to be doing and saying the right things, and we don't want to fall into any rabbit holes about accidentally saying the wrong things that could make people feel angry. And I think when you get difficult social issues, that really challenges leaders' communication skills. On the prioritization side, I think it's look, we live in an always on world, and it's really understanding how to be able to take yourself off that really and be able to concentrate on things and not become ADHD, responding to everything that's hitting you all the time. And that's not easy. I know, I observe my 29-year-old daughter just takes herself off various forms of social media and says, I'm having a social media holiday on Instagram or whatever, right? And I said, oh, you can do that. And I think the next gen, they do it more naturally than us who use all of these media, but are responding to it perhaps more than we need to, but we want to get the communication right.
Yeah. Is that sense of prioritization important, John?
Yeah, it is, and I'd like to just come back a little bit on this interpersonal thing, because I sense this may be the only thing we've talked about tonight where Anne and I may have a slightly different emphasis. You see, I think that you've got to be able to listen if you're going to be a good communicator. You can't just be on broadcast and assume that you devise some fantastic message, some way of putting it across, and then you're on transmit the whole time. And I think the ability to listen and to appreciate the impact that your communication is having, and therefore, and the need perhaps to modify it, is really important. And I think, that's why I think good interpersonal skills really do matter, whether that's interperson face to face with people, whether it's interperson through, internal channels within a company, or whether it's more broadly in social media. So I would persist with the notion that I think, it's an absolutely key requirement for successful modern leaders.
Yeah, but absolutely. It feels like interpersonal skills and communications are key, and indeed prioritization of time, which I'm coming to very clearly now because we're running out of time, and I know both of you are very busy, and I'm not going to take any more of your time. I really appreciate the fact that you've given us an hour of your thoughts and about your experiences. We've covered a huge wide range of subjects. I allowed myself to be a journalist a couple of times and lead you down a couple of sort of more newsy areas. So forgive me, and I hope we've answered some of the audience's questions around management and around the sort of ideas that you bring to the boards and to your management teams, and in your case, in MasterCard. And indeed, the stuff you were talking earlier about some of the future roles you'll be taking on in different areas as well now. So, companies in very good hands indeed. So again, just all I can say is thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Anne, for joining us this afternoon. Hope everyone listening and watching at home has enjoyed it as much as I have. And again, please come and do it again with us sometime soon. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.